That's Enough Out of You podcast is sponsored by Todd John's Law. Unfortunately, bad things happen to good people, whether it's the result of an auto accident caused by the carelessness of another driver or being charged with a crime. Dealing with the aftermath of a personal injury accident or being involved with the criminal justice system can be extremely difficult. That's why, whatever you're facing, you should never go it alone. You need an experienced attorney who will stand by you every step of the way. Todd is experienced, licensed, trusted, respected, and guaranteed. No one will work harder or more diligently on your behalf, and he will personally handle your case from beginning to end. Located on Drinker Street in Dunmore, Pennsylvania, Todd has been representing the legal rights of Scranton and Wilkes-Barre personal injury victims and those accused of a crime for over 20 years. At Todd John's Law, the utmost priority is ensuring that your rights are always protected and that your case is resolved as quickly and fairly as possible so that you can move on with your life. Call Todd John's Law at 570-876-6903. With Todd John's Law, you will receive equal justice under the law. All right. Welcome to That's Enough Out of You. I am your very happy host, Bill Rader, and joining me, as always, my co-host, Mr. Sean Kane. Sean, what's going on?
Billy Raids, how you doing, buddy?
We're doing pretty good today. Got some nice weather, got some yard work done, played a little bit of guitar, doing pretty good today.
Outstanding, buddy.
So we got some housekeeping, I guess, or what would you call it? Things.
Well, we want to first, today. Billy, we'll talk about, we got to remind people we got a merchandise store up. Anybody looking to buy mugs, shirts, we got everything up there. We're also looking into some affiliates. We got a nice book club coming. We're working on that. Should be up maybe in a couple weeks. Some other affiliates too. We're still on Patreon, so anybody that could help us. That'll be great. Our website, we got a bunch of articles up there. And then just, if nobody could really help on Patreon, just sharing these podcasts, the promos on social media, that helps us so much. Pass it on to your friends. And we just want to grow and get the truth out there, And one of the things is, Billy, is we welcome all feedback on this show. We welcome it. But the one thing we're not going to tolerate is we're not going to tolerate disrespect to the guests that we have on, because we got a really good network. We got some fine authors that come on and they do a lot of research. And, when people are just, it's fine to debate them on something they said if you coming back with some documentation and something to back it up. But if you're just going to be combative about them and not have any type of evidence, and it's pretty apparent that you didn't even listen to the episode, that's disrespectful. We're not going to tolerate that. And we're not going to tolerate just rumors, like people just throwing out all these rumors. This is what we're trying to avoid. This is why we had Don McGovern on, and he goes through the dates and stuff. Right. And this past week we had a guy just tossing rumors out there about Bobby Kennedy and Marilyn Monroe and all this stuff, and nothing to back it up with. If you're coming back with something, we want some type of source. And I don't mean the guy at the bar at 2 a.m. That's not a source. I want some kind of documentation and stuff like that, because we're just not going to allow trolls to take us over, buddy. So
yeah,
I just want to get that out there.
Yeah, we definitely police our social media pretty closely. We don't let anything like that hang around there. So, if you're gonna try to do that, don't even bother.
But we do give a little leeway to the American Patriot, because he had some humor.
Well, because he's probably our number one fan.
All right, Billy, we got a great show today, and we got a great guest, pal. You want to introduce him?
Yeah, we sure do. So Scott Alfieri, is that how you pronounce it, Scott? Yeah. Welcome to That's Enough Out of You, Scott. Coming to us from Northern California. Where are you exactly? Where are you located?
So I'm in Danville. I'm like 35 miles east of San Francisco, about 15 minutes.
Oh, you still there?
Yeah, I'm there.
Oh, okay. I think we lost you. We lost you for a second. You said 15 something or other.
Yeah, 15 minutes from Oakland, California.
Oh, there you
Basically.
go. Okay.
Yeah.
Sounds good. And so Scott, we got a lot of questions for you. Lots and first and foremost, we want to thank you for being a Patreon. That's amazing. We really appreciate your support and anybody that supports us. All of our patrons, we thank them, but definitely thank you for doing that, for supporting us. It's a big help to us, to the show.
No problem. I love what you guys do. I love listening. I mean, I think my first episode was one of the Lisa P's shows from like a year ago.
Oh yeah.
You know, I read her book and I was like, I want to listen to this podcast. So
yeah, cool. Yeah, and we've got another Lisa P's appearance ready to go in a couple weeks. So she's been what you would call an invaluable part of this podcast. She has not only with her appearances, but also with helping us get all these wonderful guests. So I think we thank Lisa every week, just as a matter of course on this show.
She's helped me write a couple of statements, and I haven't met her in person yet. I look forward to, but she's awesome, and her book.
Yep, yeah, she's fantastic. All right, so Sean, let's get this kicked off.
Okay, so today our topic, I really want to hone in on the Rockefellers, because we talk a lot about the family, but we haven't really dedicated a whole show to that. So before we get into that, though, Scott, I want to, if you could take a few minutes, tell us a little bio about yourself, and because your resume is impressive, buddy. And talk about your studies, going back to school, and some of the places that you traveled, because it's really impressive. If you could start off with that.
So yeah, I mean, so I when I was young, my dad was a corporate guy. He's retired now, but when he worked for Clorox, in the early 80s, I lived in Barcelona for 2 years. And then as I got older and we moved out to California, I got into surfing. So I started to travel I've been to Costa Rica twice. I've been to Nicaragua 4 out of the last 6 years. So 2017, 18, 19, and 2021. And I've been to Japan twice, I got into this internship when I was an undergrad at UC Santa Cruz. And we were studying a story of a Japanese soldier who was 19 years old in 1945. And he was, he had no battle experience. So when he was called up, he was sent to Manchuria instead of being sent, obviously, to the Southern Islands where they needed some battle-hardened troops as the Americans. We were pushing up towards mainland Japan. And this gentleman got in a battle with Red Russians, so like the communist Russians, and instead of the typical fight to the death kind of stereotype that we have of all the Japanese soldiers, he threw his rifle in the river and survived in communist China, and what would be communist China, for the next 10 years. And when he got back to Japan in 55, he felt really out of place, basically, because the Japanese secret police were following him around, because they were sure that he had to be a communist or communist affiliated to survive in China that long as an ex-Japanese soldier. So he and his brother and his wife got visas to go to Watsonville, California, which is in the middle of Monterey Bay. And they were picking strawberries. And this gentleman and his wife and his brother started dumpster diving for flowers that other nurseries were throwing out. And they started growing those flowers. And one day, a guy from the New York flower market, the farmer's name was Akira Nagamine. And Mr. Nagamine told us that an Italian guy from the flower market in New York came out and offered to finance a nursery. And so by 1960, he had one of the biggest organic farms in California, and the first basically organic farm. And it's still open today. And Mr. Nagamine is alive. He's 101. And his daughter went to Stanford and is a doctor, and she's still a practicing doctor, and she runs the farm. So what we were doing was researching his history, because his daughter had come to my professor and wanted the university to get involved because they didn't have the resources to do a lot of research. So we got basically grants to go to Japan and work with students at Yokohama National University and a professor named Hiro Matsubara. And we went back there 2 Decembers in a row and tried to piece together what he was doing in China and maybe what the Japanese government had thought of him. And so when we were doing that, each of us who were in the internship had to pick something that we were going to study, like a specific area. And I chose Imperial Japan and oil. So that was my first kind of foray into Standard Oil and the Pacific War and things like that. So
impressive, buddy. Talk a little bit about your statement of intent in your studies now, and I really want to get into how the elitist families like the Rockefellers, how they go into these other countries and take over their resources and stuff like that. So talk a little bit about that, about your studies.
Yeah, so I want to go back to graduate school, and I think I would have already been back, but to be a history PhD candidate, I need 2 languages besides English. So I'm making sure that my Japanese, as we speak, I'm taking classes to make sure my Japanese is up to speed, because my Spanish is pretty good and I can read and write in Spanish, but Japanese I was a little more challenging. Even though as an undergrad I did take a little of it. But my statement of intent is basically to explore elite criminality and US foreign policy in Latin America. And the way that it ties into Japanese studies is that the biggest diaspora of Japanese citizens post-World War II was to Latin America, and particularly the countries of the Amazon basin. So Brazil, Bolivia, Argentina, Ecuador, Peru. So yeah, that's and I mean, the Rockefellers, they're definitely not the only elite family that got involved in getting into Latin America.
Right.
A lot of the other ones were what we'd call now evangelicals, whereas the Rockefellers were, they were Baptists. John Rockefeller Sr. and Jr. were Baptists, but they weren't necessarily zealots. Some of the other families, like the Pews, who owned Sunoco, what became Sun Oil became Sunoco, and I'm blanking, the people who owned Quaker Oats, and then some of these citrus growers in Southern California, like the Fullers and
right.
Yeah, the Irvines, they were all involved. But what they kind of teamed up in that the Rockefellers they teamed up to fund these evangelical groups that would first go into Latin America, and they were translating the Bible for the different tribes in Latin America in the different countries. And what the Rockefellers did was kind of co-opt that and organize it in a way where they had government agencies, U.S. government agencies, like the Coordinator for Inter-American Affairs, which Nelson Rockefeller became head of when FDR made it a government organization in 1940. And they would set up like a business end, which was a non-governmental organization. And then they would set up it was like Wycliffe Bible translators and the Summer Institute of Linguistics. And at that point, in the early 30s, the 2 biggest competing families were basically the Morgans and the Rockefellers. And the Morgans had all their investments, at least 90% of their investments, in Europe with France and England. Right. And the Rockefellers had moved into Latin America, especially with Nelson, took a big interest in Latin America. And so he's traveled down there. And John Rockefeller, after Ludlow, John Rockefeller Jr. was more into philanthropic. He was trying to clean up the family name because they really took a beating after Ludlow, deservedly.
Well, Scott, before I want to go into Ludlow because that's just unbelievable. But before we get into that, let's just explain to our listeners a little bit about the family tree, because I feel we tossed the names out here on our podcast, but I don't know if our listeners actually fully understand the family tree. Let's start with J.D. Rockefeller and then Jr. And then I guess the third generation would have been, David and Nelson, the most powerful names in that group. If you want to just explain a little bit about the family tree.
Yeah. So John Rockefeller Sr. was the grand poobah, right? He was the guy who started Standard Oil and made it into what the United States government called a monopoly. I think the case was 1909 that it was brought against them. And what's funny about that, real quick, is that the government lawyer who was prosecuting that was a JP Morgan guy. So you can almost look at those two families were jockeying for who was control of things, right? I mean, at least who was gonna be in charge. And so yeah, I mean, so John Rockefeller Sr. was the man who started Standard Oil, and he really led the I don't know how to say it, the business interest moving into the frontier and kind of parceling that out where resources were. And I mean, there were other families involved, but John Rockefeller Sr. was the man. I always look at if anyone's seen the movie There Will Be Blood, and the character that Daniel Day-Lewis plays, who was a real person, but I typically think John Rockefeller was that type, right? Like,
yeah, I did see that movie.
Yeah,
yes.
yeah.
So that type of character. And then his son, John Rockefeller Jr., stepped right in to do the Standard Oil thing. And then when they had the Ludlow, massacre, basically the miners at a Colorado mine demanded better living conditions and better wages. And there was actually a Senate hearing on it. And what ended up happening, in short, is the National Guard opened fire on the tent city that the workers had set up. And a bunch of the families of the workers had dug kind of like basements underneath the tents. And when the National Guard burnt down this tent city, many of the women and children, I think it was 22, and I think
something
11
like that, yeah,
were basically incinerated. They suffocated, but they also were burned after. So, and no one found clean up the camp. So it became a huge scandal. And that's when the Rockefellers, John Jr., started to get into philanthropic type of activities to try and help their family name. And his wife, Abby, was different than him in that she encouraged her children, who were John Rockefeller III, then Nelson, and then David, and then Lawrence. And then there was a daughter, and I'm forgetting her name right now, but she encouraged them to go into she tried to get them to be more philanthropic and care more about people. And she was the force behind the MoMA, so the Modern Museum of Art in New York, where Nelson kind of got into doing cultural exchanges, which were a good way for him to get to know the important people in certain countries. Like, he became great friends with Lázaro Cárdenas of Mexico, who nationalized Standard Oil's holdings there, but so it was the third generation really who affected the 20th century. So it was the sons and the daughter of Abby. I'm forgetting her maiden name, but it's Abby Rockefeller. I think it was Abby Aldridge Rockefeller, and then John Rockefeller Jr. And so and it was David and Nelson who really took the lead. John Rockefeller III was more into charities, and he didn't really get into the Standard Oil business, but it was Nelson and David who not only got into Standard Oil business, but really got into all these other businesses, mining, any kind of natural resources. And Nelson loved art, as we all know. Nelson was the most public of all of them. But, early 30s, during the Great Depression, the Rockefellers had a real estate company, and it was getting hit pretty hard. So they merged with a bank that would become Chase Bank. And by 1948, David Rockefeller was the senior vice president of that bank. And they happened to be the ones who got into Latin American investment big time. They were the biggest investors in Latin America of any bank in the world. So, and Abby's daughter married so Nelson's sister married Charles Schwab.
Yeah, you see how everything is, they're all connected. All these powerful families, they're a lot you see a lot of intermarriage and to keep everything connected.
Yes. And I think it was Abby's father, who was Winthrop Aldridge, who was he was a state he was a state senator, and I want to say from Indiana, but it might have been from the South. But he was big into the Rockefeller business as well, and he was a board member of United Fruit, along with a lot of other people who are in the U.S. government, like the Dulleses.
Yeah,
But
we talk about them quite a bit.
yes, you guys do. And obviously, John Foster Dulles was the head of Sullivan and Cromwell, who was Standard Oil's main lawyers, and they were also so in Guatemala and Latin America. There was one company that owned basically all the railroads, and
United Fruit.
It was the International Railroad Corporation of Central America, and United Fruit and the IRCA shared basically the same board members. So you're talking about, and the bank from Boston, the J. Henry Schroeder Bank,
right,
was the major investor in United Fruit and the IRCA, and so their law firm was Sullivan and Cromwell. So like these people, they're all tied together, right? It's not to quote another, like it's what George Carlin said. You don't really need a formal conspiracy when you all hang out in the same clubs and you go.
Right.
You intuitively know what is good for each other, right? So it's
and of course Schroeder ties back to the Nazis.
Schroeder does. So Schroeder is a 200-year-old American bank. So they have ties to the Nazis later on, but they were Germans who left before the Nazi party. But yes, they definitely have ties. I think when I was talking to you guys last, at least through email, I talked about in 1942 when Truman was a senator, they had a Senate hearing on U.S. companies that were impeding. I think they called it fair competition, and they cited Standard of New Jersey, which was, I think it became Exxon, but that was the main company that the Rockefellers, after the Standard Oil was divested, did all their business through, and their biggest partner was IG Farben, which was a huge German, petrochemical company. And they got it. The Rockefellers were basically almost prosecuted. They brought charges, but they never brought it to court. That they wouldn't share. They had a recipe for synthetic rubber, and they wouldn't share it with the U.S. government. And their biggest shareholder in Standard Oil was IG Farben, and they were helping IG Farben with the like mathematic formulas and stuff, so they could produce the synthetic rubber at their plants in Germany. And it turns out that their biggest plant was right next to Auschwitz, and that interned Jewish Germans and other Jews from Europe were the ones doing the work there. And IG Farben, the people who didn't work, obviously got gassed with Zyklon B, which is a chemical that IG Farben also made. So, yeah, again, going back, the Rockefellers didn't really most of their investments were in Latin America and Southeast Asia and Japan. So they weren't in a rush to go to war with Germany. However, the Morgans were definitely in a rush to go to war with Germany. So, yeah, you get that. And Sullivan and Cromwell was deeply invested with a lot of Nazi companies, at least companies that would become Nazis, like ThyssenKrupp, which is still around, which is a big elevator company now, and they build other stuff like buildings and all that. But yeah, so there's definite ties, and the Rockefellers were not keen to go after Germany. It took them a little while. It took them till like 43 till they were really all in.
Scott, can I ask you about the Rockefellers and their ties to the Federal Reserve?
So I don't know a lot about that. I do know that when the Bank of Philadelphia was disbanded, so it was by Andrew Jackson, and he created the Fed, that it was basically oligarchs took it over. I mean, there's a quote from FDR. I'll post it for you guys. But FDR told one of his army generals that basically, we all know this has been this country right now, and the Fed has been run by the oligarchs since the Fed was, which is very dark, right? But
right,
yeah. So like, I know they're involved with the Fed, and as we get, so there's going forward to 1961 and 62, Kennedy and David Rockefeller, head of Chase Bank, had this series of letters that they were exchanging back and forth. And I was reading a couple of them, and because economics is not my field, it was kind of hard for me to understand what exactly they were talking about. They were talking about like balance of trade and the gold standard, where Kennedy wanted to keep the gold standard, and for some reason David didn't. And yeah, that was hard. The one thing I did get from those letters is that with Kennedy's program, the Alliance for Progress, which was his attempt to create a program to build up Latin America and create a middle class, Kennedy wanted to get rid of the existing format of private bank, which would have been Chase Bank, to the Latin American government for loans. He wanted government to government loans, which would basically have very little interest. And that would be promoting like things like building schools and making drinking water accessible to everyone. Just the things that you need to have like a healthy society before you can have economic output, right? And what David wanted and Chase Bank was obviously private bank, Chase Bank, to government loans that they could control the interest, obviously, and keep these countries in debt, but also that they get the U.S. government would back up their investments in case the lands were, or the holdings were expropriated, which they saw as a big problem, which they were always kind of angling against, which goes back to Guatemala, right, where Arbenz tried to expropriate land. Actually, land was expropriated, and it was actually what Arbenz did was in response to United Fruit. So after he was elected, an executive for UFCO is what I call it, but United Fruit Company, named Walter Turnbull, he came down to Guatemala only 7 months after Arbenz was elected. And he basically demanded that the existing labor contract would be extended for another 3 years. And he also wanted guarantees that the company's modest taxes would not be increased and that their investments would be protected against a devaluation of Guatemala's currency. And, Arbenz tried to negotiate, but what he did was he literally tried to negotiate. He came back to them and said, well, what we would prefer is that you guys lower rail freights, because at that point there was only one railroad and it was owned by the IRCA and United Fruit. And it went to the Caribbean port of Puerto Barrios. I'm sorry. And so they wanted the freight rates to be reduced, because at that point, the International Development Bank in 1951 had said that those rates were the highest in the world. So Arbenz was like, why don't we compromise here? Why don't you lower the rail freight rates, and why don't you guys begin paying some amount of export duties? And maybe possibly, this is probably where he really got in trouble, was to pay for the use of the Guatemalan land. And they didn't like that at all, right? They thought, okay, this is a problem. Like, Alan Dulles in his memoir, which who knows how we take that, but he quoted saying that, Arbenz was basically a stooge of communists, which is not true. I mean, Arbenz, yeah, he was not. He was definitely a nationalist. I mean, when you look at the policies he ran on in 1950, he wanted to build a highway to the Atlantic to end the monopoly of United Fruit and the railroad company, their monopoly on foreign trade, right? And he also wanted to build a power plant to end the monopoly of the United Fruit Co. plant that they owned. And it was the only one in Guatemala. So they basically had a stranglehold on the whole country. And he was just trying to get some kind of room. I mean, and Arbenz was the landowner, right? We all know in Latin America, there's since the Spanish arrived, there was a class divide between the people who were of Spanish descent, so the mixed race people, and then the full-on native Indians. And Arbenz had Spanish blood. He was a big landowner, but he really thought he became a nationalist, and we didn't like that. So United Fruit Co.'s response to Arbenz was to lay off 4,000 workers and basically, ignore them. And so what the Guatemalan court did is it seized 260,000 acres from United Fruit as guarantee for the back wages that the workers were demanding. Now, the thing is, 85% of the land that United Fruit Co. owned in Guatemala was fallow. And they said they needed it fallow and unused in case there was ever an outbreak of disease in the banana plants, and they could move the plantations. And so what our Bens seized was unused land to give to people so they could grow their own food. This is not radical craziness. This was, he basically took about 25% of their land in total, because they seized 260,000 acres. And then there was a labor settlement in 1952 between the union head for United Fruit Workers in Guatemala. And what the settlement was very advantageous to United Fruit Co. In exchange for like $650,000 in back wages, they extended the 3-year deal that the executive Turnbull had come down and wanted extended. So they got what they wanted, basically, but they thought, it was a bad precedent. Like, who is they? Well, the people in charge of United Fruit, the board members. So you have both the Dulles brothers. You have Thomas Cabot, who's the son of Henry Cabot, or the grandson of Henry Cabot Lodge, the famous senator who, wanted an American empire. And then John Moores Cabot also. So that was his cousin, who was the Assistant Secretary of State for the Inter-American Affairs Bureau, which is a government agency created under FDR. And Dulles and both the Dulles brothers were board members of Schroeder Banking Corp. And then Henry Cabot Lodge, who was a major shareholder in United Fruit, was the UN ambassador from the U.S. and a U.S. senator. And then President Eisenhower's personal secretary, Ann Whitman, her husband, Edmund Whitman, was United Fruit's president. And then United Fruit's director of PR was Edward Bernays. So, and if you know who that is, this guy, he basically created the idea that all socialists are communists, right? And if you're a socialist, you hate capitalism. And then there was also Walter Beadle Smith, who was the Undersecretary of State. And he got a seat on the board after the coup in Guatemala, the board of United Fruit. So you had a lot of U.S. government officials who, in their private lives, were sitting on the boards of the bank and the railroad company and United Fruit, who had
and Scott, to me, that's such a conflict of interest when you have like the Dulles brothers sitting on there, because of course, a CIA director, Dulles is going to initiate a coup and overthrow our Bens.
Yeah, and definitely, right? It's in their interest. And between 1942 and 1952, the United Fruit Co. increased its assets by 133% in Guatemala and paid stockholders 62 cents for every dollar invested. So they were making money hand over fist. So they were threatened, and it also threatened the whole hemisphere, right? If our Bens could do that, then what would other countries do, was the thought. It's just like before 1954 in the 30s, when Cardenas expropriated all of Standard Oil's business in Mexico. That was a huge problem. That's not going to be tolerated by the powers that be, right? And we can go into like further back in the founding of the country, but there's a lot of belief in, the Puritans had Calvinist base, like predestination type of things. So people like the Rockefellers and the Pews and the Morgans believe that they got to their position because they deserved it, and that it was their mandate basically to do these type of things, which is really dark.
Really dark. And Scott, one thing that this is something that I've talked with Lisa Pease about. The one difference, and this is my personal opinion, like when I see the comparing like an Allen Dulles and a David Rockefeller, let's just say, to me, there's a difference in the Rockefellers. Their agenda is strictly about power and wealth. They amass as much as they possibly can and trample on whoever they want to. Where Allen Dulles, to me, and I'm definitely not defending Allen Dulles because we hammer him on the show, but he, in his mind, everything that he's doing, everything he did is justified in the realm of national security. He sees himself as a patriot. Where amassing wealth isn't his interest. It's national security. So he sees himself as a patriot. I think that's the difference with the Dulles brothers and the Rockefellers.
Yeah, I'd agree.
That's just my personal opinion.
I agree. The Rockefellers, they saw government as something that they need to co-opt in order to further, like you said, Whereas Dulles, he was a zealot. He believed that the Soviets were a huge threat, and he after. So yeah, that's what he was. I mean, he was also a bit of a nut. Like in David Talbot's book, he outlines how after Rockefeller's son came back from the Korean War with the traumatic brain injury, he sent him to Sidley Gottlieb. You know, like,
yeah, the MK Ultra, yeah.
I mean, to do that to your own son. Now, maybe he didn't know exactly what was going on, but after a bit, you had to have an idea, right? So,
Scott, let's go into that a little bit. Tell that story of what happened to him, because that to me I agree with you. Dulles is totally crazy. I'm just saying, like, in his mind, he sees himself as a patriot.
Yeah, and I think that story, so his son came back from the Korean War. He got shot in the head, and all the people around him that he was serving with said he was a hero, like he was defending a retreat, and he got shot in the head, and it caused like emotional issues, right? Where he would have, from what I read, he would have these outbursts, and he would. It's kind of funny because he would tell his dad that he was a horrible person and things like that, and he also had like social issues where he couldn't live on his own, and Talbot didn't really go into what those were, but he couldn't like be by himself in an apartment. He couldn't do those things, so it was a big burden on Alan Dulles and his wife, and they didn't have a lot of money, so they didn't really know what to do. And so Dulles went to Sidney Gottlieb and Jolly West and brought his son up to, I'm forgetting where the hospital was in New York, in Upper New York State, but brought him there for about, I think, a year, and where they did all kinds of stuff to him, to the point where it made him crazy, and he'd have even worse outbursts when he saw his dad, which, looking back on it, is not surprising, right? I mean, that would make you, they're doing something terrible to you and you know it, and you'd blame your loved ones. So eventually they sent him to a sanitarium in Switzerland. And I guess this sanitarium was somewhere where they let these patients be. They didn't poke and prod them and give them drugs. And so Dulles tried to bring his son back, and he told his dad, "I'm never going back to the US, and I'm not going to live with you." And yeah, that's the truncated version of it. But yeah, his son, I think for 3 or 4 months, they were giving him, they didn't say the specific chemicals, but we're guessing it's the mind control stuff.
Right.
And trying personality and build him back up. And I always wonder if Dulles was trying to help him, or he was really frustrated that his son would say that he was a terrible person and doing terrible things for the country, right? Like, I mean,
yeah, you have to wonder that, and those names that you mentioned, Sidney Gottlieb and Jolyon West, we talked about them a little bit on our show, and we're definitely gonna talk about them in the future, because we have an episode coming up on Charles Manson where they tie into it. And, Jolyon West, of course, was also the doctor that went to visit Jack Ruby.
Yep.
And we know Ruby was a total mess after whatever West did to him. And it was useless to any investigation. Go ahead.
Yeah, no. And another little side connection is, so in 1938, Robert Johnson, head of Johnson & Johnson Company, the big pharmaceutical company, went to Nelson Rockefeller and said, I have a guy who I think you should incorporate into your new proposal for the coordinator of Inter-American Affairs. And it was his vice president or president of operations in Brazil and Venezuela. And his name was J.C. King. And J.C. King would go on to be once the CIA became the CIA after 1948, he would become the chief of covert operations in the Western Hemisphere. So he's involved in the Guatemala coup. He's involved in the Bay Pig. And all these drugs that they, besides LSD, which was obviously made in Europe by the Sandoz Corporation, a lot of the drugs that they found were from Brazil and were Johnson & Johnson Co. kind of first discoveries. So there's another Rockefeller tie into all that, right? I mean, it's yeah.
Well, Scott, talk a little bit about Brazil, because there was a coup there in '64, and of course, Kennedy and David Rockefeller had such a big disagreement on what to do in Brazil. You want to talk about that a little bit?
Again, it was over the way that they were developing Brazil, right? And Kennedy, with like the Alliance for Progress, wanted to. So the president of Brazil at the time, I think it was Vargas, he was a nationalist. He was another nationalist who wanted to. I mean, he was also from the upper class landowning, class in Brazil, but he was a nationalist, and he wanted to develop the country, and he wanted he wanted all the resources that are in Brazil, which is the most abundant, rich natural resources in all of Latin America, just because its size and how much of the Amazon is within its borders. And he wanted to develop that for themselves. And he also wanted control of the economy because so there was a lot of investment before World War II in Brazil. And then when the Great Depression hit, they backed off and it really hurt the Brazilian economy. So they started to feel like we need more control of the local corporations that are taking out things like rubber, which was really the first crop that they started working with down there. And that's what Vargas wanted to do. And Kennedy said, basically, I'm fine. As we all know, Kennedy was like, I'm fine with people being nationalists and even socialists as long as you're not in bed with the Russians, like Russian communism, that we were not going to have that. But I want you guys to build up your countries. I want you guys, to help people. And it's funny because Nelson Rockefeller, who was in charge of most of this, along with David, who was the bank, the head of the bank who's funding it, he was a pragmatist and he kind of danced on the line because they push to take these resources and stuff. But he'd also had these charitable organizations and these religious organizations like the Summer Institute of Linguistics going down there to do charitable stuff because, it was a double-edged sword. He wanted to build the local populations up enough to where they could be good workers for his business, right? Like
exactly, that's exactly what he's doing.
Because the Summer Institute of Linguistics would translate the Bible into these native languages and into Spanish. So what it did was help leaders like Vargas or even Arbenz kind of bring these groups into the fold nationally. So there was dual benefit there, but ultimately, the Rockefellers did it to get their hands on the natural resources, and they worked with the upper classes in those countries, the few, to exploit around. I was just reading something in Mint Press News a week ago where a bunch of evidence has come out that under Bolsonaro's regime, this secret police organization in Brazil that started out being like the Bureau of Indian Affairs that was set up by the CIA in the 50s, massacred a lot of Indians when Bolsonaro was there. And that's not really a surprise because that's what was going on.
No.
For 60, 70, 80 years in Latin America. And it's hard to blame one group because some of the upper classes of these countries were definitely doing it as well.
Right.
So, Brazil has every type of resource you could imagine. They have beryllium and tungsten and manganese and everything, and cattle grazing and all that. And the Rockefellers, who were amazingly pragmatic, would find like areas like the state of Minas Gerais where they can do industrial style agriculture. And so they actually got from the Morgans, I think it's called United Harvester, which was they made like machines to do big style industrial agriculture, and they owned that. And they also they went into business with Cargill to grow seeds, to standardize seeds. So they would own everything, right? It was vertically integrated. They would own the seeds, they would own the farmer's land, they would own the machines that the farmers used. So basically you're keeping these people in debt with their payments and all this stuff to the seed companies and the harvesting companies. And it was all going into the Rockefeller coffers. It's brilliant, disturbing, but it's
disturbing, but brilliant.
Yeah.
And Scott, I think one of the main differences between Kennedy and really just about everybody else, is that he recognized that these leaders were actually nationalists and wanted independence, and he was anti-colonialism, anti-imperialism, and one of the things that was fantastic that he did was the Alliance for Progress, and of course that would later be crushed by Rockefeller. But just explain a little bit about that, because it's like Kennedy wanted to give these countries low interest loans and so a lot of places grants. And that's so different from like the IMF and the World Bank, where they're actually like a Brooklyn loan shark, juicing these countries where they can't even pay the interest back on the loans, and then they pretty much own the country and take over all their resources and everything. So can you talk a little bit about the Alliance for Progress and what happened to it after Kennedy's death?
Yeah, it's exactly what you said. Kennedy wanted to literally help the people in the country build up, because he thought they have resources that we need, and if they build up a middle class, they can have a stable economy and we can all trade, and because we all have stuff that each other wanted, and that's how a global economy would work. And so his Alliance for Progress was intended to do just that. And after he died, I mean, LBJ let all that stuff lapse, but he didn't out right away. But then, by 71, it was gone. The Alliance for Progress was just, they declared it like just a bad program, when when in actuality, no one tried to actually carry it out the way Kennedy wanted to. Right. And that it's a tragedy for Latin America. I mean, you look at the last 150 years and you wonder, if you think about it this way, even if you're just totally looking at it through an American point of view, if we really wanted a stable group of states around us, then the way to do it is to build up their economy and not have them live in poverty. I mean, because this opens them up to being influenced by people like Russia or other countries like that. I won't say North Korea, because I think they're a joke, but particularly, we really want democracy to succeed. The way we've gone about it has not allowed that to happen, and that makes us less safe as a country, at least in my opinion.
Absolutely. No, I totally agree with you.
I mean, the 4 times I've been to Nicaragua, the Nicaraguan people are awesome. But as an American, you go down there and you see things like how people live. I mean, their livestock lives right next to their house, which has dirt floors. And when it floods, they're walking through water that you're going to get Hep B from, or Hep A or something, because there's feces in the water, and there's no garbage pickup. There's things that we totally take for granted here. And you just think, I mean, is it really like a mandate from heaven that allows us to have it and not them? That makes you kind of sick. At least me, it makes me sick to my stomach. These people are all good people. And like Malcolm X said, study history and learn about others. In the end, you'll find we have more commonalities in our lives than we realize. And I think that's totally true, So, I mean, the Alliance for Progress, it's just an opportunity lost. And the other thing is it makes Latin Americans not trust us. So if one of our president, if Trump or whoever gets elected next, or Biden comes out with one of these programs, they don't believe in us. They don't believe we're going to do it. I mean, they believe it's going to be the same repeat of the last 100 years. And frankly, there's so much precedent for that. So it's tough. Yeah. I mean, it's tough. And we don't hear a lot about, like, for instance, this coup, and it was a coup, whatever it was, the democratic process playing out in Peru about 6 months ago. The president who was elected was a teacher. And what he wanted to do was start charging the mineral extraction corporations 70% more in taxes. And so what ended up happening, in short, was that he thought he had to suspend the Constitution and elect a new parliament to get that done. And when he did that, other forces in the government said he's a dictator and this and that, and they overthrew him. And now the person in charge, she is not going to raise taxes on any of those companies. And I mean, it's hard. It just makes you, with the past history, you think this is history repeating itself, right? This is not, the guy is a nationalist, and we're not going to allow him to do that, because it's a bad example. Again, another example, and it's in Southeast Asia, but The Guardian came out with a story 2 weeks ago that Imran Khan in Pakistan was overthrown because he told the United States that he wanted to remain neutral in regards to Ukraine. So, I mean, yeah, we kind of do what we want, and yeah, it's.
And of course, we know what the Dulles brothers did to everybody who wanted to stay neutral in the Cold War.
Exactly. They anyone who wanted to be neutral was gotten rid of. And I don't mean, like, Arbenz wasn't murdered. They thought about murdering him, but they thought it would have made him a martyr. So what they did was exiled him, which they do with a lot of these leaders. They don't always go to the assassination card, but they try. In a country like Nicaragua, I mean, they had a president in 1909, Zelaya, who wanted to be a nationalist, and Teddy Roosevelt helped get rid of him. So, and he was exiled as well. So that's just one of those, we keep it. The problem is what our security bureaucracy has done has worked, so they keep doing it. And I think that's the value, like what you guys are talking about in a lot of your episodes on your show, is all these, it's not necessarily who did it, but when you read about and look at how these incidents or assassinations are carried out, you see
Right.
the model distance. You can see this has so many similarities to something that came before it that it's most likely an op. You know,
Right.
like
Exactly. It's an intel op.
Right.
yes, you know, like, so yeah. I mean, it's. I just wish we could approach it another way. And I know I've been told by some of my friends who are in international relations and stuff that it's a naive way to look at it, and that might equals right. And I just don't believe that. I really believe that, like, we all need to trade with each other because not every country has all the resources they need. And as an American, I believe that with all of our advantages, with our geographic size and the abundance of resources and our cultural just mixing, that we in a fair competition will beat anyone. I It's like what RFK Jr. is saying, you know, like with the Chinese, we shouldn't be competing with them militarily. We should compete with them economically, and we
Right.
all will do fine. You know, like, I mean, we need the Chinese and they need us. So
So, I mean, when we say might equals right, why does right have to equal force? Like, why can't right equal help? You know?
yeah,
Right. Exactly.
yes, that we believe in our democratic institutions, right? Like, instead of, you know, it seems like the people at the top of the CIA, and I think this was said to RFK Jr., he reported a couple weeks ago by Mike Pompeo when he had dinner with him, that the upper echelons of the CIA don't believe in the democratic institutions. So
Yeah.
it doesn't have to equal. We've the people in our government have made that happen, and I guess we as the electorate haven't done enough to stop them.
Yeah. Scott, I got another question, kind of getting back to the Rockefellers, and I not that I, you know, expect you to have an answer for this. I don't know if anybody really does, but is there any in your research, is there any way to estimate the net worth of the Rockefeller family? I mean, I know there's so many different tentacles that they have so many different things, and I know there's a lot of money tied up in trusts and investments and things of that nature, but I can't even imagine what that number might be.
Yeah, I saw a number that estimates that right now everything they own is worth 1.7 trillion, but I think it's got to be more than that.
It's got to be more. It's got to
Wow.
be. I mean, it's really impossible to. They're involved in so many things.
Yeah.
Yeah,
You know, it's
crazy.
unbelievable. I mean, mining and banking and oil and all these resources. It's just incredible.
That was their base, and now you look at, so in the book That Will Be Done, they have a chart for everything in the Rockefeller Trust as of 1976, and we're talking, we're talking Monsanto, we're talking IBM, we're talking
Apple, right? Didn't they make an investment in Apple?
well, right now they own 7.6% of the stock, and I didn't look at what that is other shareholders, but I read that it was top three. So in a
Right.
name to the board are going to have influence and sway, right? Like,
Sure.
Yeah.
I do know right now the Rockefeller Investment Management Group owns BlackRock. So,
Whew.
investment companies in the world,
Yeah.
and are and is the biggest shareholder of BlackRock, and BlackRock is the biggest shareholder of Vanguard. So, and those are two of the four biggest passive equity companies in the world. They're responsible for like third of the total money in the global economy, which is insane.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, it's big time money. Like,
Big time. And when you see lists and you list them in the billions, because I've seen that, it's a joke. That's a joke. They're in the trillions.
Billions. Oh, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I've seen lists like when they put out these most the richest people lists, and I've seen the Rockefellers on there in the billions, and it's laughable.
it is. And
That's pocket change to them.
figure out right now which of the new generation is taking over. I mean, David lived to be 101 and died in
Right.
2017. Right? Like, wow.
Mm-hmm.
So it's hard to know who's in charge right now because I think there's over 150 heirs.
Right.
But I mean, it would be hard not to get involved in the family business if you're at least for a couple of them, right? I mean,
Sure, yeah.
And a lot of these guys like David and Nelson Rockefeller and Alan Dulles, they believe in the philosophy of Thomas Malthus, who he believed that war and famine and was necessary for population control. And this is where a lot of these guys get their thought process from, and they believe in that. And this is where there was such a battle with Kennedy, because everything Kennedy believed in was the opposite of what Thomas Malthus believed in.
Yeah, Kennedy, it's not a big deal anymore, but Kennedy was a Catholic, right? And there is that charity to Catholicism, and I'm not saying there's not that in Puritanism, but like the Puritan strain that the Rockefellers and some others came out of was very Calvinistic, and so you believe that people, it's not necessarily directly like predestination, but it's that kind of thing. Like they're poor because they deserve to be poor, right? I mean,
right. He was also Irish ethnicity, and he understood that what the British did in Ireland, and that's why I think Kennedy was so anti-colonialism and anti-imperialism.
Yes, yeah.
Because he's seen that. He's seen what happened there.
It came from nothing. They came from poverty. Like, yes, his grandfather was an oligarch, but he wasn't. I mean, he knew his family history, so he knew what they had come. And he identified. I feel like he identified with immigrants and with people of the poorer classes. So that makes a huge difference. I have family on my dad's side that are from Sicily, and my dad's father was, a World War II vet. He fought under Patton. He got 2 Silver Stars, a Bronze Star, a Purple Heart. And he talked about when he was a kid, that they had come from so they weren't totally poor in Sicily. They had land, but he identified with that. And he talked about, like he was very uninvolved in religion because when he was younger, all the kids had jobs. He was the oldest of 4 brothers, and everyone had jobs, and they'd come and they'd put their money weekly in this jar in the middle of the kitchen table. And the priest would come by every week to have dinner with everyone. I guess this is what they did back in the day. So in the 20s and 30s. And the priest would take money out of the jar. And my grandfather thought, with all the resources that the Catholic Church has, and they're taking money from poor families. And he just, and that turned him off, and feel like that's, I identify with Kennedy. It's that type of strain of, at least trying to empathize with people and realize like we're all from somewhere else, and we all came here because we were looking for better opportunities, so. Yeah.
I mean, unless you're Native American, your ancestors came here
exactly
somewhere else.
Yes, we are.
Most people don't understand that.
Yeah,
no.
Exactly. They forget. Maybe it's conveniently forgetting. Like,
and I think the Kennedys, they were really the outsiders of the 1%. They were never in that group with the Rockefellers and the Morgans. They were kind of always on the outside.
They were. I mean, going back to Ludlow, the miners who were massacred, they were mostly Irish and Italians, who at that point were the recent immigrants, right? So that's those are the people who were working those jobs, so.
Absolutely.
Yeah, it's an unfortunate history, but we have all this.
But it's important to understand it.
Exactly. We need to talk about it, like it recognized. It doesn't.
We'll have to do an episode on that, Sean, and the Molly Maguires and
Yeah, we're working on a Molly Maguires, but yeah, the Ludlow massacre could be an episode by itself because there's so much there, and that was such a disgusting thing. I mean, that was just really, I mean that's just awful. Everything that happened there, and I think a lot of people don't know that story.
Yeah, and even so Rockefeller Sr., one of the ways that he was able to get the land, which was not uninhabited like we are sometimes told by people, but was the property of Native Americans, even though they didn't have property like we understand it. He would go out there and he would go into these villages and people would be sick, and he would say, I have modern medicine that could help you, but you got to sign over the deeds to your land.
Right.
And that's gnarly. That's, I mean,
Wow.
blackmail.
Yeah.
Like, you want your family to die? You know,
Wait, that's just like devious. That's
yeah.
It's and because they were considered non-white people, no one in any kind of government structure did anything about it, right? So it was our manifest destiny.
Yeah. Right.
Yeah. You know, Scott, there's a lot of places that I wanted to get to. We don't have time to, all of them, like Indonesia, Freeport, Sulphur, and Vietnam. But the one place I want to talk about is the Congo and the King Leopold and the massacre that he did to the people over there. And of course, forcing people in the rubber company that's owned by the Rockefellers. And then, they were involved, their money was involved in the mining companies in Katanga. They're mining all the resources. So you want to talk a little bit about the Congo?
Yeah. So Lumumba, unfortunately for him, he decided that he was done with the Dutch, right? And so he came to the Americans, and in particular, like JFK and other Senate leaders in the 50s, and he said, I don't want to be dominated by the Dutch, because at that point, like the uranium that was being sold in the United States was called Dutch uranium, even though there is no uranium in the Dutch state proper, right? So what we did was kind of help them, and it was a backdoor for the Rockefellers, unfortunately, because at that point, like the Katanga mining stuff company, the Dutch had 200 million invested in, and the Rockefellers had only 2 million. But when Lumumba came to the U.S. government officials, they saw a way to get rid of the Dutch influence and for them to expand their own. And that's tough. It's almost the same thing that happened in Indonesia. I mean, Freeport Sulphur, like Greg Polgrain, Dr. Polgrain talks about.
Right, we had him on.
Yeah, you did. And Freeport Sulphur they started in Cuba, just mining sulfur. And you think, what does the sulfur company have to do in Indonesia? But in 36, the Karstens expedition is where they found that huge gold mine, which they thought was the largest gold mine in the world at that point. And so basically after World War II, they started to kind of move that towards the United States sphere of influence. And it wasn't necessarily the United States, but it was the Rockefeller interest, because they were building all this infrastructure there. So that was the beginning of that. And Freeport Sulphur got kicked out of Cuba, basically. They got all their stuff, all their businesses expropriated. And that was a big part of David Rockefeller's Chase Bank business. So Freeport Sulphur and sugar companies. And in 61 at Punta del Este, which I think Kennedy spoke at as well, but Che Guevara gave a speech where he basically said, unless you guys deal with us fairly, we're not going to deal with you at all. And that's what kind of drove them, at least the Cubans, to work more with the Soviets. Because, like they didn't necessarily want to be Russian communists, but they wanted to be independent of the United States, which they felt was not dealing with Latin America for 100 years, right? And, as my Peruvian buddies also talk about, the Inca had a 3,000-mile highway that went up through all of Latin America. So from the tip of Argentina all the way up to the Yucatan in Mexico. And it was only after the Inca disintegrated, we're not sure why, that these independent Indian groups kind of formed, right? Because there was no large state anymore. So my buddies tell me, like, Che Guevara's idea to have like a pan Latin America was not a new idea. It was kind of like a reinvention of what the Inca had done. And we all know that from what we know about the Inca, they were brilliant. I mean, they did stuff that we still don't know how they did it, like building at 14,000 feet and all those kind of things. So.
Right. Yeah, and of course, going back to, Lumumba, of course, Lumumba's assassinated, and there's a lot of documentation now to back up that, Dulles sped up the assassination before Kennedy, while Kennedy was president-elect, before he could actually officially take office, because he would have probably backed Lumumba. And, just the fact that when they give Lumumba their freedom, they give the Congo their freedom, knowing that they're going to, the Rockefellers and them are backing, the Katanga to secede from the Congo, which really would have been a disaster, because the Katanga was like 75% of the wealth of the whole Congo. So they could have never survived on their own without the wealth of the Katanga, and they knew that.
Yeah, and
So, go ahead.
stoke those local tribal divides, right? Because
Mm-hmm.
it helps the Rockefellers and their business interests, which is very similar to Indonesia, right? We're going to let them be independent, but they're going to be so poor, and then we're going to start I'm forgetting the communist group that started a revolution. Was
Oh,
it
the PKI, you mean?
PKI, right?
Mm-hmm.
It,
And a lot of them were actually peasants. I mean, we had Dr. Paul Grain on. They weren't your your dying the wool communists. They were just peasants. A lot of them didn't even know what communism was, and they were massacred. That was an absolute massacre. What was done to them in '65.
seems like some of the weapon shipments they got were from the CIA.
Yeah,
Like
yeah.
at Paul Grain Good has talked about it on a couple of his episodes. Abby Martin of Empire Files has talked about it. So yeah, it's hard to know if they were, and in the last 30 years, we've seen how they will invent enemies. So to get American military
Sure.
movement.
If they have no enemy, they create one.
Oh, I mean, and Lumumba, we know David Talbot has it in his book, Devil's Chessboard, that they sent Sidney Gottlieb to the Congo to try and kill Lumumba, to talk some poison. It didn't work for some.
He gave it to Larry Devlin, and they were gonna poison him.
Yes,
I think they gave it in his toothpaste, I think.
One of the interesting things about the Guatemalan coup was that at first Dulles asked Kermit Roosevelt to lead it, right?
Mm-hmm.
And who led the Iranian coup on Mossadegh. And what Roosevelt turned him down, because he said, in order to have a successful coup, the people of that country and the military of that country have to want what we want. And I don't think the Guatemalan people want what we want what the Rockefellers want. So he turned him down. So it ended up going into the hands of very familiar names, people like David Atlee Phillips.
Yeah.
And oh my gosh, Howard Hunt.
Howard Hunt.
I found an interesting quote about Hunt and the Dulles brothers, where he said, where was it? Well, he basically said that with regards to them deciding about the overthrow of Arbenz, that it's basically when the two brothers sat down, it took place for like months and months of inter and intra-agency discussion. So because you had John Foster Dulles as Secretary of State and Allen as head of the CIA, they were able to like avoid a lot of debate that normally would have made it out into the public, but been more a part of government discussion instead of just between these two guys over drinks at dinner. Like
unbelievable.
And here's let's see. Here's a quote from, so it's Tracy Barnes, who was
Tracy Barnes, yeah,
Phillips' commanding officer in regards to the Guatemalan coup. And he said, it's not just a question of Arbenz, nor of Guatemala. We should have solid intelligence that the Soviets intend to throw substantial support behind Arbenz. Given Soviet backing, that spells trouble for all of Central America. So, yeah, they're trying to invent it. And nothing's ever come out that Arbenz worked with the Soviets. They bought one shipment of weapons in 1953 from Czechoslovakia, and they paid for it in cash. That's the closest they ever got to the Soviets that I've found. So.
Yeah, and this is what they do. They always try to tie these guys to communism. They did the same thing in Indonesia. They did the same thing in the Congo, and they're really these leaders are nationalists. They're not communists.
Yeah, I mean, again, I don't think it's in the United States' interest to have these places be run down backwaters, but it's in the interest of big business, So
absolutely,
like I've heard a couple of people talk about, one of the limits to our Constitution is there's no limits on private power, the accumulation of private power. Like, it's all about limiting like state power and the accumulation of that, but there's no limit on like what someone like the Rockefellers or the Pews or anyone like that can do, that's a problem. It's something we probably need to later. I think.
And if anybody, there's a couple books that discuss really well a lot of the topics that we discussed tonight. One of them is by Donald Gibson. It's called JFK versus Wall Street. That talks a lot about Kennedy's, hammering down on the Federal Reserve. And also another one is Confessions of an Economic Hitman by
Fantastic.
Perkins. That's a really good book. And of course, the book "Thy Will Be Done" really talks a lot about Nelson Rockefeller. You want to talk a little bit about that book, Scott? Because that book to me, it's unbelievable in summing up a lot of this stuff on the Rockefellers.
It's amazing. And the authors, Gerard Colby and Charlotte Donette, started researching that book in 75, and they didn't release it till 1995. It's the most thorough. It's so thorough. It's unbelievable. And all the PDFs they include with it, like the charts and stuff, it just gives you such a feel for how the Rockefellers in particular, and basically David and Lawrence worked under Nelson. So like Lawrence was, and then he kind of worked under Nelson, like setting up airplanes, and he was the one who gave James McDonald from McDonnell Douglas the first $10,000 to start that company, McDonnell Douglas. But yeah, the book outlines, it's so in depth. It's 1,300 pages, and it talks about basically the countries around the Amazon basin and how the United States government and the Rockefellers co-opting the government infiltrated those nations and kind of basically manipulated their politics so they could have a big business. Like it's now part of it was for World War II efforts, because that's when it really got started. Like FDR dealt with the Rockefellers because he knew that there was going to be a war and the Nazis were an existential threat, and the Japanese Imperial Army and the imperial government. So he needed these guys. He needed the Rockefellers. He needed,
right.
So he let them in, and after, unfortunately, he died when he did, because I know FDR was going to have a banker's trial and the Dulles after the war for people who collaborated with the Axis, and the Dulles would have been one of them. I don't know if he would have gone after the Rockefellers. That would have been tough, but he did not like these people. And the sad thing is, the FDR's administration is probably the most progressive we've ever had. And after the war, his New Deal people didn't win the battles. It was the business guys, not that business is bad. It was the Dulles and the J.C. Kings and those types who really got a foothold. And that's where we went. I mean, excuse me. Eisenhower was recruited by Winthrop Aldrich to run for president. And Winthrop Aldrich was the father of, was Nelson's grandfather, right? So, and he was head of Chase Bank before David got to be basically the senior VP. So, and Eisenhower, as I outlined, his personal secretary was, her husband was the chairman of the board for United Fruit. So, they basically asserted their will after that. And all the resources, like I think it was over 70% of the manganese. So manganese, I know you guys, is used to harden steel. So over 70% of the manganese came from Latin America and Southeast Asia and Vietnam and Cambodia, right. And those, which the Rockefellers had their hands in. As we all know, David Rockefeller was making the most money and Chase Bank off of the war in Vietnam.
Oh, there's no doubt about that. Yeah, absolutely. The money he made off of that war was incredible.
Yeah, and just like Latin America, they had infiltrated. I'll put up some maps before this comes out, and it'll be from Thy Will Be Done. But they show where, like, the Summer Institute of Linguistics and the Wycliffe Bible translators, which were Rockefellers were the major funders of, where they were in Vietnam and Latin America, and where they were before these conflicts, and how they kind of had a foothold in those countries. So it's
right.
They were there socially and anthropologically before they were there economically. They were very smart about
when people say, why were we in Vietnam? I say, ask David Rockefeller.
Yeah. I mean, yes. And then, I mean, and if you get into, it gets even darker when you get into people's work like Peter Dale Scott, where he talks a lot about the drug trade, and you realize like
Right.
all these things are tied together, and it's really dark, and it can be very depressing. Like.
Well, yeah, I mean, when you have that kind of, wealth and power, you are more powerful than the president. You're more powerful than the government. You can essentially do whatever you want to do.
Yeah, and another chart from Thy Will Be Done that is just amazing is the special group for the Council of Foreign Relations. So the special groups, it's their like secondary policy group.
Mm-hmm.
Those folks ended up in Kennedy's administration, and it really. And then you look at like things like the Guatemala coup and how that was carried out, and you think there was a back channel kind of government where these guys made decisions without the democratic process, and it ties into possibly how Kennedy was assassinated. I mean, I think most of us believe that.
Yeah.
I think there's no doubt about that, Scott. I mean, is Kennedy, like you said, Kennedy was surrounded by enemies, like in that cabinet. Like a lot of these guys, like McGeorge Bundy, they were tied to Dulles. You could go on and on. Dillon, I mean,
yep.
Paul Nitze. I mean, a lot of these guys are in the circle. I think Donald Gibson's book really touches on how these guys are all interconnected.
Yes,
and it's just really, it's unbelievable.
It is. It's extremely disturbing, to put it mildly, right? And infuriating, because you think, you get a bit whimsical, and you think, what happens if Kennedy stays? What if he lives? Like, I mean, where are we now? We might be in the world. We probably would be, like, I mean.
It's unbelievable. Like Kennedy's foreign policy was different basically everywhere. I mean, he wanted out of Vietnam. He wanted to end all these wars. I mean, he wanted to end the Cold War, sooner than it did. I mean, it just so many things would have been different domestically. I mean, it's just that tragedy just is still being felt today. There's no doubt about that.
It is, and I mean, yeah, and people, the as you guys have talked about, so much disinformation to try and discredit Kennedy, and he was a politician. I mean, yeah, he said one thing and did another. Everyone has to realize, right, that I always say this: you have to get elected to make any difference.
Absolutely, and Scott, that's a key point. I mean, they got to realize that the time that he was out, the fear of communism was out there. He had to be really careful what he said in public.
Yes.
He had to be really careful. And even about pulling out of Vietnam, he had to be really careful about doing that with the election coming up in 1964. That's what people don't understand.
Yeah.
But you have to look at the documentation.
Yes. And yeah, I mean, right after he was assassinated, you look at LBJ basically going back on him on I'm forgetting the national security document he signed.
263 was the one with the advisors pulling out. And then 273 was basically LBJ signed that basically reversed it. And that was when Kennedy wasn't even in the ground yet. That would have been that Monday when his body's in a casket in the memorial.
Yeah.
It reeks of conspiracy, it's like, it's obvious. And it's, people who don't want to see it just want to say, well, you don't have direct evidence. And it's like, well, there's so much circumstantial evidence that it's pretty obvious what happened.
Sure. And the thing is, once you prove that the lone gunman didn't do it, I mean, then, you go from there. And then, these guys in the media, they just want to character assassinate them, tie them to the mafia and womanizing and drug use and all this other stuff to make him such a bad character that people would say, who killed him? Who cares? But it had the opposite effect because people are so interested and people want to know what really happened. And I don't think we can move forward as a country until we come out and it's absolutely definitive of what happened, who did it, and then we can move on from there. But we can't move on. You can't move on in history if you're telling a history that just isn't true. And that's what's being done in academia.
Yeah, that's a huge part of it. I mean, like history teachers it's tough to get tenureship now as a history teacher, even at like in the UC system, which is always best, right? I mean, it's hard. They don't want to teach that stuff. They want STEM, which is important, but like you need, if it's kind of like it doesn't matter what you're inventing, and it might not be the best invention if you don't have like context of what the needs of society are, like
right.
iPhone, but you know, do I need to carry 1,000 songs on my phone? That's not necessarily making the world a better place. Like it's great, but just yeah. Someone like Steve Jobs, who didn't have a good feel for history, but was great at creating things. And you just wonder, we're missing out. Like, we're missing out on all the things that we could do and all the things that could be invented and
Right.
and just for profit. Profit's not bad, but like we could do so much more.
Yeah.
And again,
I always said, Scott, I mean, if Steve Jobs had been interested, if he'd gotten a chemistry set when he was a kid, if he'd been more interested in that, could he have invented a cure for, cancer? So, I mean, he had such a brilliant mind. You just wonder, what he could have done.
Yeah.
But so Scott, anything else that you wanted to touch on with the Rockefellers or any other topics that you're interested in talking about today?
Well, I mean, there's a lot of interesting little tidbits, but got to take them into the bigger picture. I mean,
well, remember, Scott, you're always welcome back, buddy.
Absolutely.
We took up a lot of your time already. I think we're well over an hour, probably in an hour and a half.
Yeah.
So you're always welcome back because this is a topic, that we could discuss far longer. Even though like the Ludlow massacre, I'd really like to do a whole episode on that.
Yeah, and we could get more into, like we're open door policy or good neighbor policy, but that doesn't necessarily, it's those are government policies that like Rockefellers co-opted or ignored. One interesting thing about the Rockefellers is Nelson in particular is how he sabotaged the establishment of the UN. So he basically went out to San Francisco for the initial meeting, and part of FDR's deal with the Soviets was that we're all going to be part of the UN, and any nation that didn't declare war against the Axis, I think it was May of 1945, wouldn't be allowed in the UN. And Nelson strongly argued and won to get Argentina into the fold. Now, his motivation for doing that was because Argentina and Brazil had the biggest potential for profit, and they were both British kind of areas of influence. And after World War II, he thought, oh, those are some good properties for me to take. And so he got them in there, and that was the beginning of the alienation of the Soviets, which is unfortunate, right? Because FDR really wanted to work with the Soviets after the war. He actually pulled back on a lot of the Latin American government organizations that he had set up because he thought that the major thrust should go towards working with the Soviets. So
it's interesting you brought up the UN because one of the episodes down the road we're going to be doing with Lisa Pease is on Dag Hammarskjöld, the Secretary General, who was murdered. And if anybody read Susan Williams' book, and even Paul Green touched on it, I mean, there's no doubt that was an assassination. And now there's documentation that could tie it to Allen Dulles. And of course, Hammarskjöld was so involved in the Congo and Indonesia. And that's going to be a fascinating episode we're going to have at some point down the road.
Sounds awesome. Yes. I mean, such an important thing to understand. It's and shed more light on because we don't talk about it. All we hear now is that the UN was or doesn't work basically, right? And that they're infringing on people's sovereignty or trying to. And I think
one of these days we'll get a topic, Scott, that won't lead back to Allen Dulles and David Rockefeller because it just seems like everything we do leads back to those two guys. It's just amazing.
Yeah.
It is. It's amazing what an influence he had. Last year I went to Puerto Rico for my cousin's wedding, and I after that I went to Italy and I had to fly through Dulles International Airport, which is named after John Foster, as you know, and
right.
I sent a message to you, Sean, that I wanted to defile the bathroom, but I didn't want to.
Yeah, I remember. They got to change the name of that airport.
Dude, I mean, it's unfortunate.
It's like putting Hoover's name on a federal building. Like, just get his name off of there.
Yeah. One other thing, if anyone wants to read a great book on Guatemala and the United Fruit Coup, it's called Bitter Fruit, and it's by Stephen Kinzer.
And he's good. I know Kinzer.
It's really good book. And there's a co-author too, but I'm forgetting the name. It's really good. And it's very in depth, but it's not, it's like 300, 400 pages. So it's very readable.
Kinzer wrote a book on the Dulles brothers too, I believe.
He did. And he released one 2 years ago on,
MK Ultra, didn't he?
Poisoner in Chief. And then the first year I went to Nicaragua in 2017, I read his book. So he was the station chief for the New York Times in Nicaragua during the 80s. So he wrote this book called Blood of Brothers, which is fantastic, about the Contra War.
Okay.
So, one of the other interesting things about Guatemala is the staging of the soldiers, the coup force was done in Honduras. And those bases were the same ones used basically 35, 40 years later for staging the Contras. So.
Yeah, that's an episode down the road I really want to get into, is the Iran Contra.
Yeah. Oh. Yeah.
Oh, well, Scott, thank you so much. We couldn't thank you enough. I mean, we're taking up a lot of your time here. This has been great. And again, thank you for being a Patreon and supporting our show. We really appreciate that in so many ways, not just financially, but I mean, you're always on the social medias. I always see your comments and sharing our posts and everything. So we thank you so much for that.
No problem.
It. Yeah.
Thank you for having me on. I really appreciate it. And I love what you guys do. So keep doing it. Hopefully
same here, Scott. Thank you for the research that you do. And you're welcome anytime, buddy. We'd love to have you back.
Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you, Sean and Bill. You guys have a good day.
All right, thank you. And Sean, real quick, one thing to mention. I think we forgot to mention this in the open. One topic that actually doesn't relate back to the Rockefellers or the Dulles brothers is the assassination of John Lennon. And we had David Whalen on a few weeks ago. We've gotten such tremendous response to that episode, Sean. We're going to do a follow-up, because there's so many questions that people have sent in and comments and things of that nature. I don't know. Has David agreed to come back on, Sean?
Yeah, we have him scheduled though.
Okay, great.
He's on the schedule. I think it's going to be, we're going to record that October 1st, I believe.
All right. That's fantastic.
But it's interesting you said that it doesn't lead back to Dulles and Rockefeller, but I don't know. I kind of push back on that. I think it might not directly lead back to them, but the assassination machine that Dulles created,
right,
I think is ultimately what was responsible for the Lennon assassination. And we're going to get into, David, next time. We're going to get into who was actually, he believes, behind it. And you're going to see it's some familiar names that ultimately are tied to Dulles and Rockefeller. So maybe they're not directly involved, Billy, but some way, indirectly, somehow the ghost of those two guys comes up somewhere.
Amazing. All right. Well, we'll get to the bottom of it, and we'll get more information from David. Just great, again, great feedback from our listeners on that episode. Already one of our most watched and listened to episodes.
We got over like 100 questions on that, Billy. We're gonna have to streamline that, or it'll be a 7-hour episode, buddy.
For sure. All right. Again, thanks again to Scott Alfieri for joining.
Thank you, Scott.
Appreciate it. And that's enough out of you.